I'm sure a lot of that perspective comes from the time she spent working with her dad on his memoir. But he also had a life following that publication. Much of that life has been shared with her sister Bev and her husband Clark, with whom her dad had been living at the time of his death. And I have watched as his journey has brought Cynthia and Bev even closer together. This is a gift beyond measure. A few details. Please allow the family to exit at the end of the service, and then you can join them right outside the chapel for light refreshments, some photos, and other memorabilia, including copies of his book. I believe there's that are near the door. So don't forget to take them on your way out. I think there's enough for everyone to have one if you would like. I want to give special thanks to Jonathan Netherton, who looks like he's just running the AV equipment in the back of the church, but he also put together all of the music and slides for the service. Also, Barbara Stevens, who is a community minister here at Eastrose, is our accompanist for today. Katie Tenike and Richard Curtis will also be doing music, and you'll see them here, but you'll also see Leah Nagasi, who sent her voice and image from Costa Rica. Shar Woods will be a reader in this service. And finally, special thanks to Lois W. and Jan A.C., who set up and, more importantly, will clean up so that we can leave without feeling guilty that there's no one to clean up. It doesn't usually keep anyone from leaving. It's just, and I'll try to help you keep all the participants straight as we move along. The Unitarian Universalist Chalice is one thing that links us with other Unitarian Universalist congregations. It's lit every Sunday and also for special occasions like this one. Today, the chalice will be lit by one of Pete's great-grandchildren, Caitlin Choi. We light this chalice in honor of the life of Peter Marshall. May its light rest in us, not just during this service, but every time you feel Pete tugging at your heart, reminding you that your connections transcend time and place. The chalice light also connects all of us, making us part of one community honoring Peter, his family, and each of us, this gathered community here, to honor a life well and fully lived. And now Char Woods has some comments.
A Memorial Day prayer by the Reverend Barbara Peskin. Spirit of life, whom we called by many names in thanksgiving and in anguish, bless the poets and those who mourn. Send peace for the soldiers who did not make the wars, but whose lives were consumed by them. Let strong trees grow above graves far from home. Breathe through the arms of their branches. The earth will swallow your tears while the dead sing, no more, never again, remember me. For the wounded ones and those who received them back, let there be someone ready when the memories come, when the scars pull and the buried metal moves. And forgiveness for those of us who were not there for our ignorance. And in us, veterans in a forest of 1,000 fallen promises, let new leaves of protest grow on our stumps. Give us courage to answer the cry of humanity's pain, and with our bare hands, out of full hearts, with all our intelligence, let us create the peace.
Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn. Through the storm, through the night, lead me on to the light. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. When my way grows drear, precious Lord, linger near. When my life is almost gone, hear my cry, hear my call. Hold my hand, lest I fall. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home. When the darkness appears and the night draws near, and the day is past and gone. At the river I stand, guide my feet, hold my hand, take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home.
Had the audacity to move to Costa Rica.
This interview is being recorded for the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Mr. Marshall, welcome. So glad that you were willing and able to come today.
Thank you.
Would you, for the record, please state your full name?
Peter B. Marshall.
Okay.
No middle name.
No,
Just B.
just the B. And your date of birth?
2/21/21.
And the branch of the service in which you served?
The United States Navy.
Okay. And the highest rank attained?
Chief Petty Officer
Which war or conflict did you serve in?
of World War II.
Okay. Mr. Marshall, looking back at the time, what year did you go into the military?
1939.
1939. Why don't you tell us about that time? What prompted you to go into the military? A little bit about your family at that time, where you lived, and so on.
We were still in the Great Depression. There were no jobs. I was first to graduate from high school, yet there were no jobs for me. So I finally joined the Navy. But a little bit about my family. I was the 10th of 12 children. 6 of the children served in the military service during World War II. 3 saw combat. My parents were loving, caring parents. I was never hungry. I never had any money, but I was never hungry. They took great pride in the fact that they never had to have what they call relief during the Great Depression. The government aid was called relief, and they didn't need it. And I had a happy life. We had no electricity. We had no telephone, no car, but I still had a happy life.
Peter B., no middle name, Marshall Jr., was the 10th of 12 children of Peter and Nora Marshall. He had 5 sisters and 6 brothers. He was Uncle Pete to 37, one of whom is here. He was dad to Cynthia and Beverly, grandpa to Aaron and Keith, and papa to Samantha, David, Caitlin, Lillian, James, and Paul. He was the last of his generation of Marshalls to pass away. He celebrated his 100th birthday just 3 weeks before his death on March 15th, 2021. We believe he was also the last living POW from Guam. He was married 67 years to the love of his life, Faye Elder. They met on a blind date set up by his sister and her aunt. He fell in love at first sight, proposed 2 weeks later, and 3 months after that, they were married on March 17th, 1946. He had only been out of the POW camp in Japan 3 months when they met. He was 25 and a bit of a lost soul trying to figure out how to fit back into the world. At 18, Faye was wise beyond her age, having grown up without a mother who died soon after giving birth when Faye was just 3 years old. She left her father's and stepmother's home when she was just 12 and moved in with her grandmother. Right out of high school, she left her grandmother's home for a secretarial job in Jefferson City, Missouri.
On Thanksgiving Day in 1945, I used up about 2 months of my leave. I met a girl on a blind date. My older sister and my wife's aunt decided that we ought to meet each other. Well, it was love at first sight. She had been mistreated. She never knew her mother. Her mother died when she was 3. Father had remarried, and he married a woman much younger than him. And Faye would, when she was in high school, she couldn't go out days, not until after she'd done the larding and washing the dishes and all of this. And when she graduated from high school, the only one in her family graduated from high school. Nobody came to see her except her grandmother. And so she needed somebody to love her. And I needed somebody to understand me, I guess. And I proposed on the 4th date.
Gee, I want to know what he said after that. In the first year of their marriage, Peter grew ill with what was soon diagnosed as tuberculosis. The day Cynthia was born, the Navy doctor told Faye that her husband, who was in the same hospital, would be an invalid all his life. That doctor was wrong, although Peter would spend years in and out of hospitals. The family had moved to Phoenix, Arizona in late 1948. Faye gave birth to their second daughter, Beverly, in April 1949. Peter used the GI Bill to go to Arizona State University. In 1952, he earned a Bachelor of Science degree in medical technology. He was the first of his siblings to go to college. In 1953, the TB flared up again, and Peter was sent to the VA hospital in Tucson for treatment. He underwent surgery in February 1954, where the lower lobe of his right lung was removed. This resolved his TB for good, but he was told to spend the rest of the year recuperating. I'm sure he didn't. 1 year after the surgery, he began a 26-year career at the Arizona State Laboratory, where he eventually became the head of the serology department. I had to look it up. It's the study of blood serum, and very important today. During their first 9 years of marriage, Faye held the young family together, caring for their 2 babies, becoming the breadwinner during periods when her husband was ill and hospitalized. She drove her little girls to Tucson every weekend to stay with relatives so that she could visit Peter in the hospital. Just when things were looking up for the family, Peter was well and working in his field, and they were able to buy a bigger house and a new car. Faye's elderly grandmother became too frail to live alone and pleaded to come live with them. Theirs had been a mother-daughter relationship during Faye's formative years, and she wanted to care for her grandmother. Peter agreed without hesitation and went to Missouri to bring her home to live with their family. Grandmother Elder remained a part of the family for 6 years until her death in 1963. Their daughters were both married by 1967. Then Pete and Faye became grandparents of Aaron, born in July 1968, and Keith, born in February 1970. They loved being grandma and grandpa and spent as much time as possible with them. After they both retired, Pete and Faye moved north to escape the heat and growing congestion of Phoenix. They eventually settled in Prescott Valley, where they loved the small-town feel and high desert weather. It was here, at age 72, that Peter decided to write his memoir for his daughters and grandchildren. Faye typed every word. Later, he wrote a detailed account of his time as a prisoner of war. This was the first time that Cynthia and Beverly, Aaron and Keith, learned what had happened during the 1,368 days he was a prisoner of the Japanese. He sent a copy of his POW memoirs to the Lebanon, Missouri newspaper, which published an article about Peter. A historian, Roger Mansell, who was writing a book about POWs captured on Guam, saw the article on the internet and contacted Pete, asking for an interview. When Roger learned that Peter had only 30% VA disability, he put Peter in touch with people in Phoenix who could help with the application for 100% disability. This is something Roger had done with many of the POWs he interviewed. The process took 18 months and was emotionally painful. But Pete was awarded 100% disability. For the first time in his life, he felt financially secure enough to put aside savings every month. Over the course of the rest of his life, these savings grew, allowing Pete and Faye to help out their daughters and grandchildren. If they needed a loan, Pete always insisted that the money was a gift. Faye grew increasingly ill over the last decade of her life with aortic stenosis and COPD. She died at home in December 2013 with Pete, Cynthia, and Beverly at her side. Pete was devastated by her death. He was too emotionally fragile to handle a celebration of her life like we are doing today for him. So a simple ceremony at the cemetery was attended only by immediate family. But her daughters and grandchildren have longed to celebrate her life too. In their minds, they are forever coupled. Today, they honor both their parents. Pete stayed in touch throughout his life with several fellow POW survivors. They had endured so much together, which others could not possibly comprehend. Pete credits 2 of his buddies, Alfred Mosher and Alfred Schwab, with keeping him alive during a serious illness when he had great difficulty breathing. Every breath was painful, but he needed to not be sent to the POW hospital run by the Japanese because no one ever survived it. Camp friendships often made the difference between survival and death. After the war, the POWs occasionally visited in person and kept in touch by mail. Moshe, Schwab, and Pete called each other regularly. Schwab died first. Then Pete and Moshe talked by phone once a month. When Moshe was dying, his daughter called Pete to let him know. She said her father kept repeating that he couldn't die yet because he needed to help Pete stay alive. Cynthia and Beverly wanted to put their father's story out into the world, so they planned to self-publish a portion of his memoirs and gift the book to him for his 95th birthday. He was astonished to open his birthday present and find a paperback with his picture on it entitled 1368 Days, an American POW in World War II Japan. And that's the book that you can help yourself to when you leave. He became a local celebrity with his picture in all the newspapers in the area. Complete strangers brought him meals when he went to Denny's. He was asked to speak at local schools and veterans recognition ceremonies. The commander of the Naval Hospital in Guam was given a copy of the book. After reading it, he ordered his entire staff to read the book, and he invited Pete to come to Guam, all expenses paid, to be the guest of honor at an annual hospital celebration. Judge Johnny Gogo, a judge of the Superior Court of Santa Clara, California, was researching the history of Guam, where he was born, and discovered Pete's book. He flew to Prescott Valley to meet Pete in person and express his admiration. A historian with the Navy Bureau of Medicine and Surgery also learned of the book and included the story in their national newsletter. He worked to try to get Pete's story to the producers of the Sunday Today Show with Willie Geist for the segment A Life Well Lived. I don't know, did that ever happen? No. Almost. Without any promotion, solely by word of mouth, Pete's book continues to sell copies every month. 100 years of life. He outlived his parents. His father died while Pete was a POW. He outlived his POW buddies, his coworkers at the laboratory, and finally, his wife. Let us take a moment to remember both Peter and Faye. Believe we have a video clip of the first remembrance, which is Victor Cook, another of Peter's nephews. That's what I was going to say.
Thank you, Cynthia, for letting me take a minute to share a couple stories about your incredible father, Peter Marshall. I knew him simply as Uncle Pete. You know, there are those persons in our lives who deeply influence us without us fully realizing until the passage of time clears the fog of those yesterdays and we look back and realize the impact. Peter Marshall was such a person to me. For a time, we exchanged letters, too few, I'm sad to say. I know it gave him pleasure to exchange letters, and I regret that I didn't do more. His passage left an empty space in our hearts. Responsibilities at home prevented me from attending his funeral, but like many others who knew and loved him but couldn't attend, our hearts were there. It is a privilege and an honor for me to remember Uncle Pete today. But I must admit, it is hard to talk about someone like him. I mean, what can you really say about a person who lived to be 100 years old, grew up poor on a southern Missouri farm, spent nearly 4 years as a POW in the worst war the world has ever seen, defeated tuberculosis, married the love of his life, had 2 wonderful daughters, and lived a life in service to others? Okay, so there is a lot to say about Peter. but most of it's already been said or written, so I won't repeat. You should read his book if you haven't already. There should be a movie. What I'd like to tell you about is a couple of other things about Peter that maybe you didn't already know. In his book on page 16, Peter talks about milking cows. He mentions that he started milking cows when he was 10 years old. He turned 11 in 1932, and the same year, a young ball player named Dizzy Dean started pitching for the St. Louis Cardinals. In 1934, Dean won 30 games. By then, Peter thought he might become a ball player like Dizzy and must have mentioned that to his mother. His mother, Nora, told him that if he wanted to be like Dizzy Dean, then milking cows was good for his hands and would make him a better pitcher. I'll bet Nora had a sparkle in her eye and a smile in her heart when she said that. While milking cows may have been good for his hands, his destiny was not as a pitcher. In his book, Peter mentions the best teacher he ever knew, Harry Tabbitt, the superintendent, coach, and freshman algebra and English teacher at Phillipsburg High School. He told Peter to, quote, look for the sensible answer to any problem, unquote. It was in reference to his struggles in math, but Peter knew it applied to life in general, so he took it to heart. He applied the sensible answer solution with me back around 1995 when I was deep into family genealogy and was communicating with a distant cousin who was a professor at one of the colleges in Springfield, Missouri. She was also researching the Marshall family and stated that the elder Peter Marshall, Pete's father, had been married to a Rosa McGee years before he married Nora Haddock in 1900. You may already know that Pete's dad was 35 or so when he married Nora, who was only 16 at the time. So there was a 15, maybe 20-year period when the elder Peter could have been married to someone else, and perhaps while he was in California in the 1890s. Anyway, I mentioned Rosa McGee to several of the Marshall brothers and sisters and was nearly kicked out of the family, I think. But Uncle Pete calmly suggested that his dad's sister, his Aunt Ann, who was 2 years older than his dad and knew his dad's life very well, and in fact who lived with his mom and dad when they were first married, she would not have kept that a secret from his mom. Uncle Pete told me that based on everything he knew, a previous marriage just wasn't a sensible answer. And of course, he was right. I later dug through the original records of the alleged marriage and found out that the man who married Rosa McGee was actually named Potter Marshall, from the next county over and no known relation. Well, apparently, when the marriage license was copied by hand to the abstract of marriages for that year, it was copied over as Peter rather than Potter. And that's what started the confusion. I was happy to clear that up and get back in the family. Peter and his brothers and sisters closest to his age grew up with my mother's brothers and sisters. They were all about the same age. In fact, Uncle Pete's younger brother, Stanley, was younger than 3 of my mother's siblings, who were his nephews and nieces. In a letter to Pete, I related the story about how my mother and a couple of her brothers were told to go fetch some horses in the back of the farm, and my mother had quite a time with hers. Seems her horse shifted into high gear, nearly bouncing my 5-foot-tall mother off as he raced back to the barn. Uncle Pete said he knew those horses well, and if the dinner bell was ringing, anybody would have struggled to hang on. Dinner time was a favorite of those horses. In my imagination, I can see Peter in the barn milking cows to get his hands ready to pitch for the majors about the same time the horses came running. Uncle Pete and I never had the opportunity to visit in person very often, and when he did, I mostly just listened to whatever he would say. I was captivated. I didn't know of his time as a POW, and I had the high honor to have a draft of his book before it was published. Fresh out of high school, I joined the Navy, in part because of Uncle Pete. I also served on Guam. The Vietnam War was going on then, and I was assigned to a reconnaissance squadron that included missions over Vietnam. But before I could join the squadron, I had to complete survival training that involved one whole day training as a POW. One day. Just one day. And it was just training, not the real thing. But it was a miserable day. I cannot imagine the courage and the fortitude that Pete and the others had to have to survive for 1,368 days. They call his generation the greatest generation, and I believe that is as it should be. Peter Marshall was a pretty ordinary guy under extraordinary circumstances, and despite those extraordinary circumstances, he kept his courage, his fortitude, and most importantly, his humanity. For many years, we didn't know a whole lot about his experiences, but the fog of those yesterdays was lifted, and we learned just how extraordinary he really was. Thank you, Peter Marshall. Thank you.
Cynthia? Before I begin my remarks, I want to look at you, Leah, in Costa Rica, and tell you how much that meant to me. Thank you. Thank you. Country western singer Lefty Frizzell had a song called Mom and Dad's Waltz, and it was very popular and often played on the radio when we were growing up. Country western was big in our house. And the refrain is how my sister and I feel about our parents. And I hope I get through this without crying. I'd walk for miles, cry or smile for my mama and daddy. I love them. I want them to know how I feel my love is real for my mama and daddy. I want them to know I love them so. My very first memory is of my father bending down to tell me at age 2 that I had a new baby sister. I'm not sure how I reacted to that, but I do have a memory of it. It was a very important piece of news. My father was a family man. He was a loving son and brother. He was a devoted husband and father, grandfather and papa. He was intelligent, hardworking, and he was very funny. He was also a born storyteller. When Beverly and I were small, we shared a bed, and it was often a challenge to get us to settle down and go to sleep. So a mom would send Dad in to take care of that chore, and he would come and sit by our bedside and sing us a song or tell us a story. And the stories he made up on the spot, and they usually featured the adventures of a cowboy and his dog. And I can still picture this. He named the dog Sinbev. Oh, we had a contest going for days, you know, we were supposed to guess, but anyway, it was Sinbev. And the song he most often sang to us was You Are My Sunshine. And I asked Leah if she would sing that. And if you want to hum along or sing along, you can.
This next song is one that we're going to do together. It's one that you all know, You Are My Sunshine. It was a favorite of the family and was sung in the house a lot when the girls were growing up. I'm going to sing the first verse and then the second verse that most of us know, and then go right back to the first verse. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away. The other night, dear, while I lay sleeping, I dreamed I held you in my arms. When I awoke, dear, I was mistaken. So I hung my head and cried. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away.
Daddy woke us up every school morning with a cheerful, rise and shine, except for the time he surprised us with, sit up and glow. Dad gave Mom a break from cooking on Saturday. He liked to whip up his homemade pancakes from scratch, and also homemade syrup like they made back on the farm in Lebanon, or Long Lane, sorry. He was also the grill master for Saturday night cookouts. This wasn't anything special, mostly hot dogs and hamburgers, but Daddy cooked them. He was the first of his family to graduate from college. He was a serologist for the Arizona State Health Laboratory for, I have 28 years here, I can't remember. He was highly regarded and frequently sent to the CDC in Atlanta to learn new techniques for detecting valley fever, a disease that was rampant in Arizona at the time. My sister and I occasionally would go with him to the lab on Saturday, again, to give Mom a break, or Sunday, when it was his turn to go in and check the test results or feed the lab animals over the weekend. And we had a lot of fun doing that. Playing on the typewriter and sitting in the chairs that had rollers on them and going up and down the hall. We were very proud of our daddy in his white lab coat. Dad was an excellent card player, and Mom was a really good dancer. Mom used to go jitterbug at the USO before she met Dad. They made a bargain when they got married that she would learn bridge if he would take dance lessons. And we girls remember sitting on the sidelines watching them waltz around the Arthur Murray Dance Studio. Dad got the better of the bargain, though, because Mom played bridge the rest of her life, while the only dancing Mom and Dad did together was in front of the TV on a Saturday night as Lawrence Welk Band played a waltz. Dad loved all sports, but his favorite was basketball, which he played in high school. He was a good bowler, and he really enjoyed league play. But what is really closest to my heart is he was a boxing fan and watched the Friday night fights every week on TV. I would sit on the floor next to his chair and watched with him, and he explained how he scored the rounds, and then we would compare our scores. We were blessed with our mother and our father. During the times Dad was ill and hospitalized, Mom held us all together. Mom's father came to live with our family for a year when Bev and I were very little. And years later, when Mom's grandmother needed a home, my parents welcomed her into ours. She lived there 6 years, as you heard, until her death. And even after that, Dad's elderly mother also lived with them for a period of time. We learned from our parents the importance of caring for family. This is something Bev and her husband did for Dad the last 7 years after Mom died. Dad thought he could live on his own in the house, but after less than a year, he said there were just too many ghosts in the house. And he and the cat were going to go get an apartment in Beverly, and Clark said, "Oh, no, you're not." "Oh, no, you're not." Our family, I skipped a thing. They taught us the importance of doing well in school and working hard at whatever job was at hand, whether it was for pay or not. Our family played games together, from badminton on the front lawn, bowling, to card games and board games. This was a big deal in our house. Mom and Dad taught Bev and me how to play pinochle, double deck, if you know what that is. It's a lot of cards. When we were barely able to hold all of them in our little hands. In fact, Beverly used to actually take a few and stick them on her lap, under her seat, okay, because she couldn't hold them all. And then we'd get to the end and like, Bev, you've run out of cards. We were known to play marathon Monopoly games, and we enjoyed dominoes, whist, hearts, spades, and Dad's favorite, acey-deucey, the backgammon game. In fact, Dad and his coworkers at the lab had a running hearts game for, 20 years or something at lunchtime. It was cutthroat. We went to drive-in movies together as a family. It was the only entertainment we could afford when Bev and I were little. But to get into the Silver Dollar Drive-In was only $1 a car, so that's why we went there. After the POW years, Dad was determined he and his family would not go hungry. His one extravagance was a standalone freezer that sat out in the carport garage area. He would buy a side of beef each year and have it cut up into steaks and hamburgers and roasts, so there was always food for us to eat. As a single mother in Tucson with 2 preschool children, I often drove the 3 of us to Phoenix on a Friday night to spend the weekend with my parents. And without fail, my father would be waiting in the driveway, often in the dark, when I pulled into the driveway. And then one summer, a few years later, when the children and I were living in San Francisco, Mom and Dad wanted to experience Disneyland with their grandchildren. So they paid for our airfares. They drove over from Phoenix, and we flew down from San Francisco. And I got a taxi at the airport. There were no cell phones, so I didn't have any way to get in touch with my parents. I knew what motel to go to, but I didn't know if they were there yet. For sure, I didn't know. I assumed they were. And I have to confess, as the taxi dollars clicked, I'm thinking, I don't have that much money in my wallet, and I had no credit cards. So I took it on faith that they were going to be there and could pay for the taxi. I didn't know what else to do. And just as he had always done at home, when the taxi pulled up to the front door of the motel, my father was standing there waiting for me. I got out of the taxi, I hugged Dad, and I said, "Please pay the driver." I could always count on my father. And I fully expect, if there is a life after this one, that he's going to be waiting out front for me to let me in. If you can't see the front row, the sisters are doing their thing. Bev? Just look at me if you need to read it, okay? I got this. Okay. A long time ago, in a state far, far away, 2 superheroes were born. Peter, our first superhero, was born into a large farming family. He helped work the farm, graduated from high school, and did not want to be a farmer. A neighbor told him, "Join the Navy and see the world." He enlisted in 1939 and saw places he had never seen: Illinois and Lake Michigan, San Diego and the Pacific Ocean. One day, he received orders that he was being sent to Guam. Guam? He had never heard of Guam, had no idea where it was. Dad enjoyed his time there on Guam. He studied hard and became a top-notch surgical nurse. He took up playing tennis, and on December 6, 1941, he won the hospital tennis tournament. Unfortunately, not even a superhero could prevent World War II. The day after Pearl Harbor, Guam was taken by the Japanese. Peter was now a Japanese prisoner of war. It was an extremely long, difficult, and hungry 1,368 days. He survived and returned home in one piece. After all, he was a superhero. Faye, our second superhero, was born into a fractured family of 4 children. When Faye was only 3, her mom died. After giving birth to Faye's sister, the baby was raised by an aunt and uncle, and Faye rarely saw her. Her father remarried a much younger man. Man, oh my gosh. I don't know. A much, don't strike me dead.
Her father remarried a much younger woman. Faye's stepmother was not maternal and at times cruel. She spent as much time as she could with her grandmother, who gave her the love and affection she did not receive from the rest of her family. Superheroes cannot be stopped. Faye held down 3 part-time jobs during high school, was responsible for most of the housework. And she graduated from high school in June 1945, got a job in Jefferson City, and was on her way to happiness. Peter and Faye met on a blind date in November 1945 and were married in March 1946. They were very happy and giddy in love, but were about to be seriously tested. While they were stationed in Cherry Point, North Carolina, Faye gave birth to her first daughter, Cynthia. That same day, she was told her husband had tuberculosis and would probably be an invalid for the rest of his life. Faye was 19. Let's not forget that Faye was a superhero also. She packed their belongings, had them shipped to her grandmother's house in Lebanon, learned to drive, took care of her baby, and wrote Peter constantly. Clark told me not to cry. These 2 superheroes faced long hospital stays and separations, made the best of their situation, brought 2 daughters into the world, and taught them how to face life bravely, to be kind and loving, and above all, keep the family close. I cannot remember when Mom told me about a nightmare Dad had. He had POW nightmares until he died, but we never knew what those dreams were about. In this nightmare, Dad returned home from work to find our home surrounded by Japanese guards. He parked the car across the street and started furiously digging a tunnel with his bare hands. He had to get his wife and daughters away from the Japanese. Protecting their families is what superheroes do best. Cynthia and I are not superheroes, but we do have some of their superhero skills. If anyone in our family is ever surrounded by evil, we would dig with our bare hands to keep our family safe. Cynthia and I will always keep the memory of Peter and Faye alive. We will always keep our family close. That is exactly what Mom and Dad wanted. And for the record, our parents really were superheroes.
And now we'll hear from Judge Johnny Gogo.
Hello, everyone in Portland. My name is Johnny Cepeda Gogo. I am a Superior Court judge here in the state of California, San Jose, California. I want to thank Cynthia, Beverly, and Clark for giving me this special opportunity to share a few words about Peter B. Marshall. I had the chance to meet Pete in September of 2020 after I had obtained a copy of his book, 1,368 Days, and flew out to Arizona to meet Pete, Beverly, and Clark. In my mind, I had a special connection to Pete because in December of 1941, when Pete was stationed out on Guam as a young Navy corpsman, my parents were both small children on Guam. Both my parents are native Chamorros and native Guamanians. And when the island was captured in 1941, they both became part of occupied Guam as Pete was taken prisoner of war. After I learned of Pete's passing, I reached out to the governor of Guam and asked the governor to write a special letter of recommendation or commendation about Peter. And this is the letter that the governor of Guam prepared and submitted to Pete's family. The governor's award posthumously presented to Peter B. Marshall. On behalf of the people of Guam, this recognition is hereby awarded and posthumously presented to Peter B. Marshall to recognize and commend his service to the United States of America and the people of Guam. Pete was a Navy hospital corpsman who was originally stationed on Guam in early 1941. Peter worked at the Naval Hospital in Guam, and he assisted with many surgeries of wounded U.S. personnel when the island was invaded on December 8, 1941. When Guam surrendered December 10, 1941, Pete and approximately 300 other military service members, nearly 200 American civilians, 5 Navy nurses, and 5 Spanish priests were taken as prisoners of war. Peter and many of the other POWs were taken from Guam to Japan and would spend the remainder of the war, 1,368 days, in the Zentsuji and Osaka POW camps. Not all of them made it home. Pete would eventually return back to the United States and over the years would write his memoir, 1,368 Days, an American POW in World War II Japan, a memoir by Peter B. Marshall, which included fond memories of his time on and the people of Guam. Pete would share his stories and memories with local students in Arizona with the sincere hope that his story would help future generations. At 100 years old, Pete was likely the last surviving American World War II POW taken from Guam to Japan. His survival as a POW on Guam and in World War II Japan is a testament to the resilience of his spirit. Peter B. Marshall passed away on March 15, 2021, just a few weeks after his 100th birthday on February 21st, 2021. On behalf of the people of Guam, we posthumously recognize Peter B. Marshall and extend an Ndonkalu Nasuzu'us Ma'asi to him and his family for his selfless service to our island and our nation. Signed on this 31st of March in the year of our Lord, AD 2021. Lourdes Leon Guerrero, Governor of Guam, and Joshua F. Tenorio, Lieutenant Governor of Guam. I had the pleasure of personally delivering this letter to Beverly and Clark at the Arizona Cemetery where Pete is buried. Again, I want to thank Cynthia, Beverly, and Clark for, again, allowing me to be part of this today's service. And I want to God bless Peter B. Marshall, and may he rest in peace. Thank you.
We're going to open this now for remembrances from the congregation. Yvonne is going to speak first. You can tell that all these people look identical.
We're all clones. It's a family secret. Well, I rarely remember seeing Uncle Pete while I lived with my parents in Missouri. After I was born, my folks didn't take vacations. And Pete and Faye were busy in Arizona taking care of Cynthia and Beverly. But my major memory of Pete on the occasions when he did come back and I was still at home was that he was so good looking. He was known as the best looking of all the Marshall boys. I was able to know him a little bit better the last 20 years when his visits back to Missouri and the old homestead, which he loved to go to, detailed with my visits going back home to visit my parents. And I loved his good humor and his enjoyment with people and just talking and being around them. He could tell a good story, which has already been mentioned, or he could give an impromptu talk without much preparation, and he knew something about almost everything. The same as my dad. The older Pete got, the more he thought about his childhood and the old homestead in Missouri, which was called Walnut Grove. Glen. Excuse me. He was the last to remember what it was like growing up, because everybody else is dead. It had to be a time so totally different than what we've experienced. My dad, excuse me. My dad talked about it a lot too. It sounded ideal growing up, but we know it wasn't. They had money problems. Grandma had 12 kids to take care of, which was a problem in itself, I'm sure. But this is so precious to them. Before his death in 1999, Pete's youngest brother, Stanley, wrote thumbnail sketches about all his brothers and sisters. And I'd like to read some of Stanley's description of Pete, because this is a description of the boy that later became the survivor and father and uncle to so many of us. And by looking at what Stanley had written, it's amazing, because what Stanley saw, from 1933 is so much, in so many ways, like what everyone else is talking about Pete in later years. I mean, he stayed the same man, but this was his beginnings. And I'm going to read what Stanley had down. Peter B. has always been a sports enthusiast. While in high school in Phillipsburg, he played on the basketball team. He kept current on prize fighters, baseball players, basketball players, and any other activity that qualified as a sport. He also loves to play bridge and to bowl, same as Pete in later years. Like the rest of us, Peter B. attended Latimer Grade School, graduating from the 8th grade in 1935. He attended all 4 years of his high school at Phillipsburg, graduating from there in 1939. Up until graduation from high school, he had never shown much interest in any particular profession unless it would have been professional sports. He was a good student, but distracted by sports. Of the three of us at home for the period somewhat prior to 1935 until 1939, and the three that we're referring to here is the youngest son, Stanley, Peter B., and Billy. Peter B. was the most agile. He could turn handsprings, and he could walk on his hands, things that neither Billy or I could ever master. It was really tough living up to his standards. Peter B. has always exercised a kind of quiet independence that was exemplified at an early age. When he was about 4 or 5 years old, he walked a round trip of 8 miles to a store to get candy. He decided to go to the store without letting anyone know he was going. During the summer between his sophomore and junior years of high school, he hitchhiked his way to Mississippi. This is 500 miles. Again, he left without telling anyone he was going. The only money he had on him was a Mexican penny. Of the 7 Marshall sons, Peter B. and Felix, which is my dad, were the most sports-minded and the least interested in mechanics. And I've heard my mother talk about my dad. She said he didn't know how to fix anything. Peter B. was more outgoing than the rest of us, yet in a private sort of way. He seemed to seek friends from among those that the others avoided, the socially unacceptable. But as far as I know, it didn't create any serious problems for him, probably because he was such a charming man. While visiting his folks' kin in Mississippi, and this was back in 1937, Pete insisted on playing the ball with the Negro children there. And that was a practice kind of frowned upon by his mother's family. 1937, the height of segregation in Mississippi. This is a description of a boy and man that I would really enjoyed having known. But I'm at least grateful that I got to know the elder man, because he was so remarkable.
Is there anybody else from the family who has something to share? Or from the congregation? I think he told it all.
I wouldn't be alive today if it wasn't for my wife. When I was in the hospital, she wrote me every Saturday thing. When I was having surgery in Tucson, she was taking care of me. Wasn't even in school. Sarah was in first grade. She was trying to come down as often as she could, try to keep me happy. And we had a good time. That later, for an uncle, this is before he joined the Navy in Mississippi, I heard Lou Gehrig give his farewell speech to the Yankees. And he said something like, "I'm the luckiest man in the world to have been a Yankee all these years." And so I just said, "I'm the luckiest man in the world to have been married to her for 67 years. And I'll get over it someday, but
Well, you'll be together someday.
yeah.
Be unbroken, or can the circle be unbroken, is an old gospel song, old enough that passing through the hands and hearts of many, many singers, the words vary. But the song most certainly carries the understanding that we know we must let go of those we love. However, can we not hold the ties that bind us in the circle of love? Cynthia asked me to lead you in this song to finish up the service. Pete was the last of his family's generation, and a very long-lived family and tight-knit family, as you have heard about so strongly today. So please join in the chorus. I think many of you will be familiar, and we will enlarge that circle in the love here today.
Let's scoot this over a little bit.
Yeah, wherever you need it. I was standing by my window on one cold and cloudy day when I saw that hearse come rolling for to carry my father away. Will the circle be unbroken by and by, Lord, by and by?
There's a better world awaiting in the sky, Lord, in the sky. Will the circle be unbroken by and by, Lord, by and by? There's a better world awaiting in the sky, Lord, in the sky. One more time. Will the circle be unbroken by and by, Lord, by and by? Well, there's a better world awaiting in the sky, Lord, in the sky. Katie and Richard. Sorry. Cynthia and Bev. We extinguish this chalice, signaling the end of our celebration of the life of Peter B. Marshall. Now it's up to each of you to keep its light in your hearts, bringing you peace and good memories, and keeping Pete and Faye alive through your memories. Amen. I'm going to dismiss the family first, and then you are welcome to join them. We're not going back into our fellowship hall, which is ice cold. So we'll be just in the narthex and the hallway. Just let the family go first.